Y.
Vamos a dar un par de minutos antes de comenzar.
Cuando quieras, Debbie.
Nada más déjenme cerrar aquí un segundo, por favor. Bueno, vamos a dar inicio. Primero que nada, buenas noches a todos. En nombre de la Escuela Yavne y la comunidad Ashkenazí de México, les damos la más cordial bienvenida.
We are welcoming you.
Antes de empezar, les
Before
queremos recordar...
starting, we would like to tell you.
Marta, tú todavía no traduzcas hasta que hable Debbie en inglés, por favor.
Hasta que hable.
Muy bien.
Gracias.
Antes de empezar, les queremos recordar que vamos a contar con traducción simultánea. Entonces, para poder habilitar el icono de la traducción, ahí junto a en la pantalla de Zoom van a ver un icono que es un mundito y ahí le pueden dar clic para los que tienen computadora y nada más habilitan el idioma de inglés. Y para los que tienen iPad o celular, en el marco superior derecho van a encontrar 3 puntitos a donde van a encontrar la opción de traducción simultánea. ¿Ok? Al final de la sesión vamos a tener una sesión de preguntas y respuestas que podrán hacerlas aquí en el icono que también viene en la parte de abajo. Las pueden hacer de forma indistinta en español o inglés y nosotros vamos a ayudar con la traducción. Entonces, bueno, once again, on behalf of the Keile Jewish community and Yavne School, we give you a warm welcome and we thank you for being here today. To be honest, it is quite difficult for me to introduce a man such as Ishmael. I could introduce him as a 10-year-old ordinary boy who lived in Sierra Leone and went to school and had a family as any other kid. I could also introduce him as a 10-year-old boy who came across a civil war in 1991 and faced his destiny, forcing him to become a boy soldier in order to survive. Maybe I could introduce Ishmael as the migrant who came to America and was adopted by a Jewish family, or as a best-selling author of multiple books, as a father figure, or even as a UN ambassador who helps children who are caught up in conflicts. Without a doubt, Ishmael is a reflection of everything I've just mentioned, and we could certainly discuss many of the different phases in his life. However, on this occasion, I would like to present Ishmael as a human being who in his life journey found his own way, but never forgot about the ones who got left behind. I would like to introduce Ishmael as a person who defies those who believe that their destiny is determined by their past, or those who think that changing the world is a task almost too impossible to carry out. Ishmael represents each and all of us, not because of his survival testimony, but for his story of courage and kindness toward his fellow men. Today, Ishmael, if I learned something from your book, is that the most powerful weapon that we have is the ability to help others, while on the other hand, silence is the most powerful weapon the oppressor has. So without any further preamble, I give the floor to Mr. Ishmael Beah, and we feel very honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Debbie, for the wonderful introduction. I actually think that it is the first time I've been introduced in that way, and I think I like that better than other ways I've been introduced before. I want to extend my gratitude, my very sincere thank you to all of you who have worked hard to make this possible, and to all of you who are attending and listening to this conversation, and to the community. Lakaele, I hope at some point when all of these things are behind us, probably we'll be able to meet in person. I was telling Debbie that I was actually in Mexico City with my family, my 3 children, because one of them is a big fan of Frida Kahlo. So we wanted to go see her work and where she lived and existed. And so we made that journey. So when I saw the invitation from Mexico City, I responded because I'd just come from being in Mexico, being in Zalapa, being in Veracruz, being in different places. So thank you for inviting me again, virtually this time. What I'm going to do is to speak a little bit about who I am, to perhaps to touch on all those things that David mentioned, but most importantly, to speak about what it means to be a human being in the world, a young person, to come out of difficult situations and to not allow anybody to put you in a box to define who you are because of what you've experienced or been through. I was born in Sierra Leone in 1980. Sierra Leone is a very small country in West Africa that prior to the 90s, when we had a civil war, most people did not even know we existed, which we kind of like that way. Sierra Leone is a former British colony, so therefore English is the official language. So when you go to school, you speak English. But I grew up in the countryside, in a village. I'm still a village boy at heart. And before I went to school, I spoke Mende, which is my mother tongue, and then 7 other languages in Sierra Leone. And my grandfather was an imam. So I learned the Quran and I learned how to read and write Arabic. All of this before I went to English school. And my grandfather was friends with the reverend in town. So I went to a Christian primary school and read the Bible because my grandfather wanted me to understand that knowledge base as well. And so I grew up in this small village where everybody was a community. People took care of each other. Everybody knew who you were. I remember walking to another village 6 miles away when I was about 6, 7 years old without fearing anything, on the road, on the path. It was a place where you would not go hungry. Everybody would take care of you. I grew up going to the river to swim. And then when I started to go to school, walking with my friends to school, we didn't have the resources that people would consider wealth, but we were wealthy in terms of how life played within us, how the environment was very, the only way I can remember describing it properly is that it was a time that I would laugh with my entire being. If you've ever had that experience where you laugh unguardedly, as if nothing would ever break, nothing would ever happen. I remember having those moments. We had everything we needed. We'll go fishing. I played football, football as in football, soccer. I played that and I went swimming, I went fishing, I went to the farm to make fun with my grandmother. So that my life was quite ideal. Because Sierra Leone is a former British colony, when I started doing English school, I learned Shakespeare. So I will go to the village choir sometimes to recite some Shakespeare lines, which my father really liked because he could impress his friends that his son was going to school and learning English. So I would go and do that. And also I could get lunch money. So that was really nice for me. In addition to that, at some point, I was one of the young boys in my village that knew how to read and write. So therefore, when older people who did not know how to read or write English received letters from their sons and daughters in the capital city that seemed so far away, I'll be one of the people who read those letters and then write responses And through this, as a young boy, I already began to understand human behavior and what people write and what secrets people had. And so people gave me money also for this task. I don't think it was because they were trying to compensate me, but rather it's because I knew quite a bit of secrets. So it was more payment to keep the secret, you know. So I learned at a very young age also to respect people's privacy, even though they've allowed you to read it because they couldn't. In addition to that, I grew up with the oral tradition storytelling, where every evening my grandmother was one of the people in the village who was in charge of the stories. And I grew up in a culture where we believe that in my tribe, the Mende, that stories are medicine that are poured into you to strengthen you so that you're able to face and deal with life, because life would always try to break you. And therefore, the medicine of stories would make sure that you don't completely snap, that you always have some sort of foundation to go to be able to pull yourself back up. So as a kid, I was very interested in this. So I sat around the fire and listened to stories. I knew the structure of stories, how you tell a story orally, and all of these things. And I would harass my grandmother to tell me stories, because some stories were open-ended. They had questions and answers that you had to find your own truth on your own. So I would tell my grandmother, but you know, I'm your grandson. Why don't you just tell me? And she would say, well, I won't be doing you any service if I told you the answer. You have to live and experience life, and then you would understand what that story means. So this was basically my ideal life. I was the second born in a family of three, all of us boys. And then the war started in my country in the 90s, 1991. Prior to that, the war had started in a neighboring country in Liberia in the 80s. And so we would see refugees running into Sierra Leone, and they would talk about what had happened to them. And none of us believed them, because we thought there's no way human beings can be like that to each other, because I hadn't grown up in an environment where I'd seen any significant amount of violence. This doesn't mean that there were not things going on in my community. There were, but not to the level of the war that we're hearing about. Eventually, the war started in my own country, and it started at the time I didn't know, but in retrospect now I know, because you know I became an older man, and so I learned the back history of the war. The war started because of the political climate we had, where we had a government that had been in power for over 20 something years. They had basically changed the constitution to say that their political party was the only legal political party in the country. So there was no election, because if they're the only legal political party, no other party can run against them. So they basically continued ruling. The only indication that I had that that was going on was at some point before the war, there was a scarcity in the country of food, because the prices had gone up so much, people couldn't afford to buy them. And the guy who was in power at the time, Joseph Saidu Momo, basically decided that the way to do this was to basically train some soldiers who go to supermarkets, to the markets, and they'll basically put people under gunpoint and tell them what the prices were. And because of that, all the shops and the markets closed. And I remember my father waking me up around 2 a.m. in the morning to go into the forest with him, where this sort of makeshift market had now been recreated, so you can buy what you needed at the prices that the sellers wanted. And I remember going there. That was the only time that I saw there was some type of political turmoil going on in my country. But because of all that corruption, the country collapsed. The educational system collapsed, the hospitals collapsed, the infrastructures collapsed, everything. And so there was a need for a revolution, and a group of people decided to start one. And obviously, as with most revolutions, the people who funded it had different agenda. So the war became one of just of violence and of natural resources, because Sierra Leone has a lot of diamonds. And so the war became, if you ever heard the phrase blood diamond, that comes from Sierra Leone, because the war was basically fought on the blood of people to extract these minerals and take them out of the country, while everybody else was being, fighting each other and killing each other. And so as a young boy, this war came into my life. In the 90s, I was 12 years old, and I started running from the war. My father worked for an American mining company, an American and Australian mining company, that we had moved to a small town. And so I would work because of that, I would go to the mining headquarters, and I would see televisions. We didn't have electricity or anything like that, but because of that, I had access to some things of that nature. and my father's mining company would see television, and we started seeing American hip hop music. So we got interested in it, which my father didn't like because he felt it was going to destroy our proper British English. Anyway, so we had gone to a talent show, my older brother and I and another friend, when the war reached my town. And we started walking back towards my town to try and see if we can find our families. And that was the first time I was introduced to the nature of what war is. I saw children running who had been separated from their parents. I saw mothers screaming the names of their children with so much pain in their voices that you knew a lot of things had broken. But there are two images that stayed with me on that first encounter of war. Was that one was an older man who was probably in his 50s, was 60s, carrying his son, who must have been about my age, who had been basically shot to death. His body was completely littered with bullets, and the child had died, but the father was in so much pain, crying, carrying his son, and nobody wanted to tell him that the boy had died, because him trying to find a hospital to take his son to kept him away from the war that was coming. So nobody wanted to tell him because he would give up. And I just saw the hopelessness and helplessness in the face and the voice of this man. And as he went by, another person came, which is a woman back home in Sierra Leone, and in good number of African countries, when women tie their children with a cloth on their back so that their hands can be free to do other things. And so a mother came running from the war, and she had been running away, and she sat next to where we were standing, watching a group of so many people just going by in despair. And she removed her child, and her child had been shot, and it was a baby. She was maybe 3-6 months old little girl, and as she had been running, the bullet had struck her, and probably that's why the mother was alive, because she had this baby on her back. And I remember the pain on this mother's face. I will never forget. And I thought to myself, this country that I knew, where I used to walk 6-7 miles to a village, was no longer the same. Everything had changed, and nobody was no longer safe. If a 3 to 6 months old child could face that sort of thing, then none of us were really safe anymore. But I still wanted to find my family. So my older brother and I tried to see how we can do that. We returned back to a town called Matrujan, which is where we were, and waited to see. Every morning we'll come to the river and stand there all day just to see who was crossing, to see whether we see our families. And that never happened. And then the town we're living in, Matrujan, was attacked. And so I started running from the war. I went from this boy who once loved Shakespeare, wanted to be an economist, had this, simple, beautiful life, to now just running every day from the war. The towns would be attacked, and they wanted to recruit people they could find. And if they couldn't catch you, they would shoot at you. So we escaped many of these things day in, day out. And at some point, my older brother and I separated, and I never saw him again. And then I was with a group of other boys. We were running from the war, who were also in the same situation. So we started just running on the countryside. It was in those days where it was not now, where people have iPhones or other things where you could kind of, I don't know, maybe look at your Google map to see where you're going. Prior to that, I didn't know any part of my country because I've never had a reason to leave where I was living. So I basically just ran away from the war. We ran. If there were gunshots coming from the left, we went right. If they're coming from behind us, we went forward, and we just basically ran around the country. For a year, basically, I was just running between 12 and 13. I lost everything that was dear to me. My family was gone. My home was completely destroyed. And another thing happened that was equally difficult, which is that this country once, where your innocence was celebrated as a child, as it rightly should be anywhere in the world, now became a place where that same innocence was now threatening to people. Because what had happened is that all the groups in the war, including the government army, were now recruiting children and using those children to commit serious violence on their communities. So people who have survived these experiences, when they saw children, young people together running from the war, like I was with a group of boys, they basically thought we were another group coming to harm them. So either they ran away from us or they tried to kill us. So it became quite difficult to be a child in this place where your innocence became feared so deeply. So sometimes because of that, we avoided towns where we could get some drinking water, or where we could get coconut or mangoes. We avoided them because if people were there, they would either run away or they would try to kill you. And there were many times where they almost killed us. They almost tied stones to our bodies and drowned us in the water until they realized that we were actually not soldiers or rebels or anything that they thought we were. And these were very difficult moments to navigate. And by avoiding towns and villages meant that we wouldn't have access to food. So I started going hungry for weeks, 2-3 weeks at a time, very little to eat, to the point that you can feel your own body, insides of yourself. You can almost feel it, like you don't even want to breathe too much, because that was laborious to do. Eventually, I went to a town where I'd heard that my family was, and also the boys that I was running with had heard that our families were there. Before we arrived to the town, it was completely destroyed and everybody there had been killed. So we lost everything. Even the hope that we had that we could find family was lost. And so I was hopeless. I didn't want to continue on. I thought, what's the point? But the other kids that I was with helped push me along the way, and we ended up going to a government military base, thinking that this would be the safest place to go at that time. Maybe they'll protect us. And initially, when we got there, that's what they did. They gave us places to stay around the perimeter of the military camp, and they gave us tasks to help cook in the kitchen for their rations and things like that. We fetch water, cut things for them. And not in my wildest dream, I ever, the imagination even, I thought, or nightmare, I should say, that I would be recruited to fight. At this point, I was 13 years old, and one day they just said to everybody, they lined up every able-bodied in town and said, if you're living here, you're going to fight in the war for us. We need everybody to fight. If you can't, you can leave. And that was not a choice, because people who tried to leave were shot and killed. So basically, you had no choice to leave. So therein began my journey as a soldier. I was 13 years old, and I was trained briefly at how to fight and adhere to certain commands and how to shoot a weapon. And basically, they used the anger of losing everything that was dear to you to make you into somebody who wanted to seek revenge. So everybody else who was in that particular sort of military group that we were part of was the enemy. And I became a soldier, and I learned how to function. It became my new family, but with this new family, violence was what was the currency. The more you committed whatever they would ask you to do, the more you were celebrated, the more you became deeply part of the family. For the young people who are there, and again, I'll make this clear, is that when I wrote my first book, which is a long way gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier, about my experience, I only wrote about boys because I'd only experienced it as a boy. But there are also girls who were the same age and younger, who were also soldiers, who had weapons, fighting the same war, and also have the sexual abuse and all the other things that come with it. So they had it even worse than we did. And so all of these young people together, these children basically, stayed because of each other. We stayed because we became family to each other, and we wanted to protect each other. But at some point, we were also traumatized and so caught up in the violence in the war itself that we didn't know there was a possibility to exit. I clearly didn't. I didn't think I would come out or ever be able to do anything with my life. I thought this would be the end of me. I would probably stay in that war until I was dead, and nothing would ever happen. So I stayed in the war for nearly 3 years. Every day was war. Everything was always brutal. Violence became as easy as drinking water. It was to the point that you get used to it. You'll be surprised how much human beings have the capacity to adjust and normalize any situation that they are faced with. And that's basically what we did as a way to live. We're not allowed to think about the past before. If there were kids who cried because they missed their mother, they were disciplined badly or sometimes even shot. So nobody showed any emotion. So you shut down completely and became somebody. And in addition, they gave us certain drugs in the beginning, to start to take, from your little heroin to cocaine and something that was called brown, which is a mixture of gunpowder and some other substances that you basically, so you'd be high basically all the time. where the most serious violence became just like a child's play to you. And we functioned very well in these units. We're in called small boy units, and I was one of the commanders of one of my units. So I was a junior lieutenant, and I did whatever I was told to do. And our group grew quite significantly because every time we attacked, we would try to recruit other young people and adults and whoever we could find by force, of course, just like we'd been recruited. But we bought into the idea that we were the good people fighting the good fight. Everybody in the war, every group was the good group. Nobody was bad, even though everybody was committing all the atrocities. I was in this war for 3 years, and the United Nations started engaging with Sierra Leone, my country, because they really wanted to end this war. The war in Sierra Leone went on for about 11 years. I didn't stay for all of those years, but I did 3 years of those 11 years in the war, which was no easy thing. And so they came into Sierra Leone and started talking to the commanders, the different heads of the military groups that have splintered from the National Army, to try and get them to come to the table to have peace talks. And one of the requirements for this peace talk was that they would release all the children within their ranks. And so I was fortunate to be one of the early young people that was released through Unicef in particular, that went to my base and basically convinced my commander to have them look and see who was a child. And because I looked more like a child, at this point I was about 15 going on to 16, I believe 16. And so because I was more like a child, and I had other kids who were my age who were maybe had more muscles and taller, they had to verify them more. But I looked more like a child. We were all lined up and disarmed and put in a vehicle and brought all the way to the capital city of my country, which is called Freetown, in the outskirts of it, where they are set up rehabilitation centers for us to stay there and recover from the war. Now, I didn't want to leave because I knew the war that I've been fighting in for the past 3 years and the one that I ran for a year before that. I knew without having a weapon, without being part of a group, you basically become prey for everybody. So I did not want to leave. And the people who came to remove me were not military people. They didn't have weapons. They were just civilians who promised protection. So for me, I was very uncertain about what this would look like. At the outskirts of the capital city, we basically were put in a hall, like a boarding home type thing, where they had psychologists, nurses, and people who cooked and took care of us. And of course, because we're so used to violence and now we didn't have the means to do violence, we were very upset. So we would attack the workers at the center. We destroyed the center several times, burned it to the ground, and they would take it to another place. We burned the mattresses. We would attack some of the people who work at the center and beat them up, wound them badly. Some of them didn't return, but a good number returned. And so hence started our curiosity, because we wanted to know who are these people that returned to a place to work and help people that want to kill them, like literally. And so we started thinking that, well, they were more crazy than we were, but why do they care so much? Because no one had cared for us for so long. We didn't know what that looked like to want to take care of somebody. So we started giving them chances, sort of observing them to see what they were. And they were very clever, because by the time the war happened in Sierra Leone, they were removing young people from it. My country did not have a lot of psychologists. We had one psychologist, actually, a fellow called Dr. Tamba Maturi, who passed away some years ago. And so basically, he just gave a lot of medical people, nurses in particular, crash course on psychology. And basically what he told them was that you just got to make them believe that you genuinely care for them. And you got to come genuinely caring to make a difference in their lives, and they'll pick up on that. Otherwise, nothing is going to work. So basically, they took Western ways of psychology and local traditions and blended together, and that's how they started to help us. So, for example, they had a school that they set up in the center. It wasn't really a proper school. It was just a school to test where you had left off in school, so that they can know when to place you when you were fit to leave the center. In the beginning, they supply us pens and pencils and books, and we made campfire with them. We burned them. And the second time, we burned them. And the third time, one of our friends decided that, you know what, maybe we should escape the center to go sell them in the neighborhood, which we did, and we made money. And of course, we got into trouble with all the money that we had. So they went outside to speak to the traders not to buy from us. And so we couldn't find people, but instead they said, okay, if you want to go to the city to do a little tour, you have to come to class. If you come to class 5 days a week without any interruption, without any fights, without breaking things, you win a few hours to go into the city and walk around. And all of us wanted to go because we're all country boys. We wanted to really see. So we started sitting in class, and in these classes were more a therapy session. Instead of really teaching us, they were trying to find out what we were interested in before the war. And so I was interested in hip hop music. I was interested in Bob Marley. I was interested in theater through Shakespeare. So then they would find ways to recreate that for me. So through those things, I would say a lot about the war, rather than if somebody asked me a direct question, I would not answer. I did not talk about it because it was too painful to go back to. So I started making a friend who was one of the nurses called Esther at the center. And so in those days, we have some young people on this call might not even know what that is. We had Walkman, the rear Walkman. It was a cassette. You put a cassette in, you had your battery. So she would buy me this cassette tapes of Bob Marley, of Run DMC, of LL Cool J, and of all these American hip hop guys that I loved. And I would play it and we'd write the lyrics together. And sometimes it would make us make a play. And in that play, we'll make a play about the war, obviously, and then we will talk about ourselves in the third person, so we were able to deal with what had happened to us. It was very difficult for me at the center. I spent about 6 to 8 months at the center to recover. Some people left early, but that was how long it took for them to say I was fit to return. I didn't know how to function as a normal kid. I didn't know how to sleep. I'd even forgotten how to sleep. And when I tried to sleep, I had nightmares, and I would wake up and whoever was next to me was going to have the violence that I was just coming from. So it was very difficult. I tried to hurt myself in many ways. I was always looking for fights, things like that. But I was very quiet. I didn't say much about myself. Only through music and through art form, I would express myself. So Esther and I became friends. When my time at the center was coming to a close, they do an additional family tracing, which is that they try to look and see if you really have any family member left, extended family members that's willing to take you in. And not everybody was willing to take a kid who had just come from the violence that I'd come from into their homes. But luckily, I had an uncle who was willing to take me, who lived in the capital city. So I left to go stay with him, with his family. The war hadn't reached the capital city, and I didn't know how to be part of a family or be part of a family dynamic. I didn't trust in happiness. So I was on the periphery of the family, really. I did not really understand why they would laugh or why they were happy, because I'd seen so much that I couldn't trust in anything. So I stayed with him, and then I started school again. And even that was difficult because nobody wanted to become friends with people like me who were considered to be only violent. That the expectation from us was that because we had gone through war so young, we will never recover. We'll only be able to be violent, and we're time bombs waiting to explode. Nothing good was going to come of us. So nobody expected anything from us, and therefore nobody wanted to befriend us or invest in us in any kind of way. Even though for me, I was looking at everybody who was saying those things and thinking, I understand more about human nature than you, because I've seen how things can be really good, how things can shatter completely, and how you can also try to remake yourself out of it. But nobody wanted to have that conversation because I was not expected to be even intelligent, right? Because I've come out of war. So I was living with my uncle. An opportunity came to send 2 young people to New York City in the United States to speak about their experiences as a way to create policy through the international community to deal with this issue of children in armed conflict, to make sure that children don't go to war, but if they go to war, whoever recruits them is held accountable. So a study was done, and I was one of the people spoken to about the study. So we were asked to come to New York to speak, but we had to go through a process. And I was invited to go for an interview. When I went for the interview, one of many of the sons and daughters of the ministers who were in power at the time, who had basically their corruption had led to the beginning of the war, had basically their children being interviewed to go to New York and speak about the plight of children in Sierra Leone, even though they had not experienced war, they had never experienced being hungry, they've never experienced losing everything in their life, but yet they were being. So I was very upset that I was the only person in that room that I basically I guess I protested, but probably in ways that were not as intelligent as I would now. I basically threw a bunch of things. I shouted at people, and I told them that this is exactly why we had a war in this country, and then left. And then they sent one of my case officers to tell me that I had been selected as one of the young people to go to New York because of what I'd said in that room, that I was the perfect candidate to go and talk about what war meant in Sierra Leone. I was one of two selected. Now, when you leave war and you run from your home without knowing that you ever return again, you don't take anything with you. If you're lucky, only your life that you're able to come out with. So I had nothing. I only had an ID card from my that said that I had gone through rehabilitation successfully, whatever that meant. And so I knew when I was born and everything, but I didn't have any birth certificate. I didn't have anything. So through the United Nations, they were able to dig into archives for me, which I didn't even know that was possible. And they're able to get me a passport, which is a luxury item in a place like Sierra Leone, even though it's a right. Most people don't really have access to it. Because I have the United Nations behind me, I was able to get one. And then I went to the American Embassy to get a visa. And I remember, I think this is when I started thinking that I needed to tell my story, because people did not understand the context of war, the context of people leaving everything dear to them to flee for their lives and try to find life somewhere. I felt like people did not truly get it, because when we went to get the visa, the guy behind the counter at the American Embassy, behind the mirror, so talking through the speaker, basically asked me that if I could provide 2 forms of documents to show that I intended to return to Sierra Leone after coming to New York to speak. And one of them was a bank statement that showed that I had some finances in the bank. And the other was a document that showed ownership of property. Because I was coming from Sierra Leone, so if my grandfather or my parents have or had a home, so these would be guarantees that I will return to this place. And I remember saying to the fellow who was asking me the question, do you know what is going on in Sierra Leone? What war is? He was like, yes, I know. I was like, no, I don't think you understand. First of all, I'm coming from the countryside. I had no electricity, so I don't even know what a bank is supposed to look like. But let's assume that I had those things. Do you really think when a war is going on and people are shooting at you, you're running for your life, you're going to think to yourself, oh, my bank statement, I should really get it. This is the most important thing right now. Or do you really think that you're thinking, oh, property documents? I grew up in the countryside where people didn't have documents. Everybody knew that this was your grandfather's land and that was sufficient. You did not have paperwork for it. You didn't even know where it was, you know? So this fellow did not understand any of these things that I was saying. But again, because we had the UN behind us, they trusted us that we intended to return, and I got given a visa, and they bought us a suitcase to travel. Again, I had nothing. I just come out of war. Actually, I remember I had 2 pairs of pants, one short, one long. I was always wearing one, and 2 shirts, one t-shirt, and then one long sleeve shirt. So this is all I had, and they got us this big suitcase to travel. I had nothing to put in it. In those days, I hadn't even been on the plane yet. I'd never been at the airport. I've never been on a plane. So I remember thinking to myself, okay, what am I going to do with this empty suitcase? So I took it with me to the airport. And put one of the things that I had in there, one of each, 1 pants, 1 shirt, and gave them, and they checked in. I probably could have carried it on board, it was so light. And so we got on the plane, and we had a chaperone. It was me and another young man who had come from war. We had a chaperone who was traveling with us. He was our chaperone, but I am not sure why he was, because he was as lost as we were. He had never traveled either. So we got on this plane the first time in our lives, all 3 of us. And the plane, it was a KLM flight from Freetown to Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And I remember when the plane took off, it became really cold in the plane. Now in Sierra Leone, our weather is always hot. So when it's 60 degrees, it's already winter for us. We're cold already. So imagine we're on this plane, there was no orientation, and the air is so cold because we didn't know we could turn the air off, you know. And I remember thinking to myself, I just survived this war and I'm going to die on this plane out of cold, you know. And I was like, I'm not going to let this happen. I don't want to go that way. I still have to find a way. So I started looking at the exit door, thinking to myself, I could just jump off. If I jumped off on the African continent, even if I broke my legs, at least I'll be guaranteed good weather. I knew that for a fact, at least in West Africa, you know. But luckily for us, one of the flight attendants, she saw what our dismay was, and she turned the thing off and gave us a bunch of blankets. I was shivering the whole time. And anyway, we came to New York. We transited in Amsterdam and we came to New York City. And it was winter of 1996. I had never been anywhere that cold. I knew the word winter in Shakespeare, but I had no physical relationship to it. And all of a sudden, here we were, and there were things falling out of the sky. And I was thinking to myself, but why are people living here? This is not human, you know. When I stepped outside, I even agreed with that thought even more, because it was so cold. I felt that my face was going to fall off. Through a lot of conviction, we had no winter clothes. I basically had a t-shirt. I was telling you, that's what I had. And I wish I'd taken the blanket from the plane out with me, because at this point, I was like, wow, nobody knew where we were going. We thought we were going somewhere where the climate was the same, because we didn't know. We'd never left our country before. I didn't want to be there at all. I wanted to go right back to Sierra Leone. We went to the hotel and I had my own room. It was the first time I had my own room. But it was during that time that I met the woman who later adopted me, which became my new family in the United States. She was one of the facilitators. She saw that we were sitting next to the radiator, because we had figured out that that's where hot air will come out of in the winter in these buildings. So whenever we entered the building, we looked around to see where one was, and we sat next to it because it was so cold. She saw that we didn't have winter jackets, so she went home and got us winter jackets. Of course, she brought us all these women's winter jacket, but we wore them. I didn't care. I was like, as long as I'm warm, you know. So I had this very stylish, tight women's winter jacket walking around New York City. Still not cold enough, but I mean warm enough, but better than I had been. And so that's how that friendship started. Now at the United Nations, I met other young people from all over the world who had had similar experiences. There were kids from Colombia, there were kids from the Philippines, there were kids from Iraq, there were kids from all over the world who had come through some similar story behind us. So it was really interesting to see that there's not an isolation in this kind of suffering that would come out of. So that was quite wonderful. But we're all supposed to give speeches. And I was particularly supposed to give one from Sierra Leone. Even though they had selected me, they had also written something for me to say, which was basically, you know, governments thanking each other for things they have not really done. And so I did not want to say that, because I thought to myself, listen, if I'm representing the young people of Sierra Leone, who I know some of them are still in the war, and I have to say something, it's certainly not going to be what some government official writes for me on paper. So I basically crumbled the paper and threw it away, and basically said what I wanted to say at the General Assembly and the Security Council in front of all these diplomats. And I basically explained to them what war does to a child, what war does to a community, what war does to a mother, what war does to a family, what war does to a human being, and what they can do to make sure that it doesn't happen. And even after war has destroyed you, how you can remake yourself, that they should put resources to it. So I basically just spoke from my heart. And I left after that conference, returned to Sierra Leone. I stayed in touch with this woman, Laura, who I had met. And she said, I went back and I was in touch with her, you know. She said, do you want to go back to school? Yes, I'm already in school. She tried to see if she can help me go into a better school. But then the war reached the capital city and the country collapsed completely. There was no central government anymore. There was no government. And so all the commanders I knew started showing up in the capital city. And there was a real possibility of me being recruited again. In fact, some of my friends who couldn't leave were recruited to fight a second time around. And I certainly did not want to do that. So I basically just, one day I just left my country. When you leave, you don't tell anybody where you're going, because some people can be jealous because they don't have the means to live. Not that I had the means to live, all I had was a passport, which allowed me to move a little quicker than some people. And that, if other people knew, could cost me my life. So I could not say bye to my uncle or my uncle's family. I basically just left one morning. I just walked down the hill from where I was living and basically started walking to the next country. So I was a refugee. I slept on the street. I was homeless. You know, from the first book that you read, A Long Way Gone, my memoir, the story ends when I'm in the next country, Guinea, Conakry, where I started to travel around the African continent illegally. I went to Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire. I went to Burkina Faso. I went all the way to South Africa, from West Africa all the way up to Cape Town, South Africa, living with people I met on the way and things like that. And that comes with all kinds of problems. I didn't write in the first book, but eventually I got in touch with this woman, Laura, again. In those days, if you wanted to call somebody, you had to go to the telecommunications center and they place a collect call. And the person wanted to talk to you, they picked up the collect call. Otherwise, there's no conversation. And she'll pick up and she said, listen, I want you to come. I'm going to do everything I can to get you to the United States. And I said, well, can you be my mother then if that's the case? Because I don't want to come. It's just to see. And she said, okay. And so this is how I found my Jewish family in New York. I arrived and they were willing to take me into their lives. You know, I grew up with my grandfather being an imam and Muslim, and then I was adopted in this Jewish family where my grandfather was a rabbi, you know. So we have these conversations, and my name is Ishmael, so there are all kinds of other jokes around that. And I tried to get the mitzvah, and my grandfather told me that I had the wrong intention. And I was like, what other intention is there? I see everybody getting some nice little packages of money when they get a mitzvah. So I want to be part of it. Anyway, we went to synagogue, we did all kinds of things. And then at some point, some of my Jewish family in New York was doing Buddhism. We did that. So in my lifetime, I've been Muslim, I've been Christian, I've practiced Judaism and been a Jew, adopted in a Jewish family. So, and if your mother is Jewish, yeah, you all know. So anyway, so I remember going to all these parties as a young boy, you know, and I was the only Black person there probably. And my mother always tried to explain to them, yeah, this is our new son, his name is Ishmael. And I always think to myself, probably Jewish people understand what it means to leave so many things behind, what it means to suffer. So they're probably the only ones who are crazy enough to adopt somebody like me that everybody else was afraid of. You know, even though my mom's friends would sometimes check on her every night to make sure that she was okay, because I was living in the house, because they expected again that I would become violent. And so I decided to write because, again, I wanted to change this perception. When I arrived in New York, my mother started to try to take me to schools, to get me into schools. No school would take me because I could not prove that I had been in school before. Because again, they wanted paper. They wanted me to show a report card that showed what school I'd been in. And I made the joke again, be like, you know, I was running from war. I didn't think I could survive. I wasn't thinking about my report card. I didn't think I could survive. And so I decided to write. My first serious writing was an essay that was titled, Why I Do Not Have a Report Card, since everybody wanted to know. So I explained in that essay to them where I was coming from. And that essay got me a scholarship to the United Nations International School, an additional scholarship to university. And meanwhile, there was this talk going on in the world about, again, people doing research who had not met a kid who had come from war and drawing conclusions that somebody like me would not be able to function. And here I was living in New York, doing very well in my school, at the top of my class. Most of my schoolmates did not know anything about my background because I didn't feel that they were ready to receive it. And yet people were writing about people like me as dangerous, time bombs, unintelligent. And so I decided to write my first book, which is A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of Boy Soldier, really as a reaction to that, to show that these things are not true, that actually people like us who come from these experiences have a lot of wisdom to offer the world. We understand truly what it means to lose your humanity, but equally how to get it back, how to become a useful human being in your society again, how to not allow situations, violence, evil to dim your human spirit, how you can relight it again. But it all only happens if you care about other people. We understand the nature of people's lives being useful for others and how that changes things in the world. So I wanted to write to make people understand that. I didn't stop, but I decided I'll be involved, which is why I'm a Unicef ambassador for children in armed conflict, because I wanted to make sure that the children that were left behind, that were not as fortunate as I've been, would not be forgotten. So I engaged myself in going on the ground to participate in negotiation and release of these children, but also to build international policy to continue to strengthen it so that these children cannot go through some of these things. So through that, I've gone all over the world and done a lot of things. but primarily I write, and I'm a proud father of 3 amazing children and an amazing partner. And I'm trying to teach them what it means to be in this world and be a useful human being in my own small way. So in short, that's how I became a writer. That's my background. That's where I'm coming from. Since then, I've written 2 more books. So I have 3 books, and I'm working on a 4th one. I've taught writing in various schools. I've given speeches in many different places around the world. But always what I remember mostly is this. As soon as human beings, we forget that we are each other's keepers, our value system, our morality, everything starts to collapse, because then we forget the very sacrosanct nature of human life. We lose sight of that. And what I learned in the war is this: when we dehumanize other people, which we have to do to be able to impart violence on them, whether it's physical, verbal, or war, or any other way, what that happens is that when that happens in reverse, you dehumanize yourself. And that is very hard to undo. So thank you for listening. I'm going to take some questions now from some of you, and some questions have been answered. Thank you so much for having me in your city tonight via Zoom. I didn't have to take the plane to fly all the way, but it's been wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Wow, Ishmael. I just went from tears to laughter with your story, because you have a mix of emotions here. So there are a lot of questions. Just be patient with me. So I'll try to pick the most relevant ones. So the first question that I would ask you is, what advice would you give the Ishmael when he was a 14-year-old? From your adult view, what would you tell that child?
I probably would have told him, run out of the country, run out of the country, keep running until you leave your country. Don't try to run around, and try to just run out of the country. It will save you a lot of psychological pain. But at the same time, it made me who I am to be who I am today. So
I agree with you. Okay, so another question. How long did it take for you with the process of rehabilitation, the entire process from the moment the war ended for you until the moment you felt okay with yourself?
I think it's a lifelong journey to recover from trauma, particularly from war. But I think, the 6 months I spent at the center, and then really until I had a family in the United States, I had a home, that's when I really started to believe in the possibility of having some kind of stability in my life, So I would say from that point on, I think at that point I was like 17 years old, 17, that I started to believe in the possibility of something again. But every stage of my life, I have to learn how to deal with this experience differently, For example, when I decided I wanted to be a father, and we were having our first child, I had to think about what this experience means to me in becoming a father, because there's a rare possibility of transmitting that trauma to your child if you don't deal with it. And I did not want that for my child. So then I had to find new ways to deal with it. You see what I mean? Even when I decided to have a partner, to get married, I also had to find a way to deal with what that means, So at each stage of my life, I had to learn how to face what had happened. But I think really the bulk of it is the writing of the book. Really was very cathartic in its own way, and it was my last big therapy, because I allowed myself to return to the story again on my own terms, right? So there was a little bit of power in that to learn about myself. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a person asking, how can self-forgiveness be achieved?
Self-forgive, how can it be achieved? It's work. It takes work. But for me, at some point, I came to this conclusion that, I had seen so much, and I'd been part of so much things that were bad, that if I allowed them to become only a burden, it will kill me completely. It will destroy me. But how can I repurpose and refocus them? What are the things that I learned from that that are essential to live well and live as a good person? So that's what I try to focus on. And then I started to look at even the possibility of self-forgiveness. I started to look at the possibility of, well, for example, I came to a relation where I was a kid when the war started. So it wasn't like I started a war. You know, we've had this argument with other people who say, well, children who come out of war should not just be forgiven. And I always respond to them, if you show me a war that children under 18 started by themselves, then we can talk about how we can hold them accountable, because they've never have. So at some point you have to come to that realization. That doesn't get rid of how you feel, you know, in terms of, you know, how you hold yourself accountable for some things. But then you try to live a good life and do good things and hope it will balance the scale a little bit.
Wow. I still have more questions. I have many questions, Ishmael. How much time do you have? Okay. So it says, during the war, what was the most difficult moment? Something that marked you, that mark who you are, a moment that was a point of no return for you.
I mean, there were many, but I think the first time that I went to war, I had seen war, I had ran from it, I had seen people being shot at, but the first time I participated in war as a soldier really changed a lot of things within me, and my reflexes, how I feel, how I think, what I expect from life. It changed that because I basically had to lose myself completely, and I could feel it standing there that first time I really went to war. And I think for me, that always remained with me. But also I was with a group of other friends who were younger than I was, if you can believe it. I was 13. There were kids who were as young as 7, 8, and most of them lost their lives that day. So that stayed with me because I felt responsible that I could have done something, or what, you know, so that really changed me. Yeah.
Okay, so there is a student who read your book, and she wants to ask you a personal question. If I don't know if they can turn on the camera for her, she wants to make the question because she adore your book, and I'd like to give her the camera so she can ask the question directly. So Raquel, if you can turn on her camera de Adi, please.
Yes, she can. There she is.
Hey,
Hello.
well, first of all, I just wanted to tell you how excited I am for talking to you. Not every time you have like the opportunity to talk to someone that is the author of a book that really touched your heart. So that is that. Well, my question is, now that you are an activist and defender of human rights, from an outside looking lens, what lesson have you learned about child soldiers inside a conflict?
Mm. Well, first of all, thank you for the comments. It's a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for reading the book. It's not an easy book to read, so I'm always appreciative to young people who take the time to read it. Emotionally, that is not an easy book to read. From looking from the outside in, you know, which, and I do this work, one of the things that I've learned is that, first of all, I think there's nowhere in the world where any children want to go in violence. It's only when it's the only option that's left that sometimes they go into it and embrace it. There's no child that wakes up and say, I just want to be in violence. Nobody does that. So that's one thing, because sometimes people say, well, some of these kids went and there's no such thing. The other thing that I've learned is that when children are removed from war in any country, there's always a stigma that can either make them go back and embrace violence again, or they can actually become useful members of their communities. And I've seen this in Colombia, you know, inside Bogota, in Medellin, where people don't have a certain way of looking at kids who come from a certain group than the other, that those kids feel so stigmatized, they just go back to what's normal, right? So I think what the society does to embrace children back again can change their lives. And lastly, is also what opportunities young people are given when they come out of war, you know, can really change their life. For me, I was given real opportunities to go to school. Nobody would have believed that I would be a good student because of what had happened to me, but I went to school and I became a really good student because I knew how to be very disciplined, because I've been a soldier, so I could use that to study. And I think often people forget that children coming from any kind of trauma, not just war, are incredibly intelligent and strong. That's the reason why they survive all the traumas. And sometimes people forget that resilience is a kind of intelligence. It is not just something that everybody just has like that, you know? Anyway, so that's what I've tried to explain so that people who are working with children directly can understand these things.
Okay, so my last question.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Abby.
Okay, so my last question is, what would you tell the young people on how to change the world? What can they do to make this place a better one?
Well, first of all, don't wait until you're an adult, because the world is so broken that by that time, I don't know if there's be any of it left. So, and also, you know, believe that just because you're young doesn't mean that you don't have innovative and new ideas to change the world. Don't doubt your own contribution, you know, think about what you can do. And lastly, most important, I know it's COVID, so it's difficult to say that, to do that. But lastly, and most importantly, see the world. Learn about different cultures, different people. Don't hold any points of view until you've actually experienced what it means to live in different parts of the world, to have different value systems, you know, meet people at a human level, you know, and do it differently than other people. Don't be afraid to challenge your values and your morality. Is the only way you're going to strengthen them. If you don't want to have any conversation with people who are different from you, it means that you're afraid that your own value systems are not as strong. So challenge them constantly. That's the way you strengthen them. Don't fear things just because somebody else says that they are like that. If you're on social media, befriend people from completely different environments than you and get to know them, whatever it is that you do. Have empathy. Be empathetic, you know, as a human being. That's what I would say.
So I have endless questions, but I really appreciate and admire all the things that you have done so far and coming here with us. And it's an honor for me and for the rest of the Jewish community to hear your story. And you're truly an inspiration, not only to adults, but to young people who are in their way to find a different life for them and who want to make a change in this world. So I appreciate being here, and hopefully you will come to Mexico one day and you can visit us.
I know now. I know that I have my Jewish community now, so I will definitely come. I will come. I know I will get fed a lot. That I know of.
I told you, you're already Jewish, so you're welcome to this community.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you to everyone who made this possible and for attending. And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, Ishmael. Y muchas gracias a todos por estar en esta conferencia con nosotros, y espero que haya sido de su agrado, y pues les damos buenas noches y que tengan un buen día. Bye.